Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. Tonight is a very special edition. We have what I believe is going to go down as one of the most important days in the history of modern Mormonism. It is April 4th, 2019. It's 5:12 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm Dr. John DeLynn, and today we received a stunning, earth-shattering announcement for many in the Mormon world. As many of you know, back in November of 2015, the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, stunned the world and its membership by releasing what is now known as the November 2015 policy. I was one of the first people to publish awareness of that policy that was first leaked to Reddit and was shared with me privately on Facebook. But basically, as almost all of you will know, the November 2015 policy was an announcement by the church, a change in policy, which declared same-sex marriage to be an act of apostasy, an immediate apostasy requiring a church disciplinary court and or excommunication, which actually put same-sex marriage as more egregious than pedophilia, rape, sexual abuse, and even murder in the Mormon Church, according to my and other people's interpretation, which was an extremely stunning and disheartening announcement. But there was more. The Mormon Church also, in addition, added insult to injury by adding a policy that it basically just copied and pasted from the polygamy world, where it prohibited the children of same-sex couples to either be blessed as babies or to be baptized or to participate in the basic ordinances or rites of passage or progression in Mormonism, such as baptism and the receiving of the priesthood, etc., with the exception of allowing the children of same-sex couples at the age of 18 to be baptized, but only if they denounce the marriage and the love of their LGBT parents. And this announcement was stunning for so many reasons. The church had gotten into Proposition 8, and it had received a lot of backlash for that. And then when Mitt Romney was running for president, it seemed like the church was becoming more progressive. The church released the Mormon and Gay website, the Mormon and Gays website. It seemed to be making positive progress. And then, of course, when the Supreme Court decision happened, legalizing same-sex marriage across the world, across the United States, it seemed like the November 2015 policy was a reaction to that. For those of you who are paying attention in this realm, you will also know that shortly after, when this policy, the November 2015 policy, was announced, Thomas S. Monson was prophet of the church, and as most people will acknowledge, he was suffering from dementia. And so he was not in his full present right mind. And not only that, but it's been largely assumed or understood that Russell M. Nelson and or Dallin H. Oaks behind the scenes were instrumental in enacting this November 2015 policy. And the further evidence of that was that in the winter or in the following spring of 2016, Russell M. Nelson gave some talk at like BYU Hawaii or wherever he was, and he basically assured the listeners that it was revelation that led to the November 2015 policy, which again was extra disheartening for those who were paying attention. The impact of this policy, I think, by all accounts, has been devastating to the Mormon Church. I think the church has seen mass resignations and disaffection from the church. I think that tens of thousands of people have resigned from the church through Quit Mormon and through other areas because of this policy. I think that a very large number has gone inactive just quietly without resigning as a result of this policy. And we know that with millennials, particularly in the United States, that this policy and the church's LGBT policies in general have been devastating to church activity, to church membership, and to church engagement with kind of the millennial, younger folks. And so, this was devastating. It was disheartening for so many. We've had several couples, LGBT couples, get excommunicated between November 2015 and today. The church has gotten hammered and eviscerated in the media. We saw Love Loud come onto the scene, which was Dan Reynolds and Imagine Dragons, basically becoming raging activists against the church's LGBT policies and for, same-sex marriage and same-sex love and for the LGBTQ community. We've seen Encircle come on the scene, which is a LGBT safe house for youth in both Provo and Salt Lake. And we've just seen lots of different activities, including things happening with affirmation, with Mormons building bridges. There's just been so many ripples, it's just hard to capture them all. But one thing that's been pretty much consistent is the opinion that the church has painted itself into a corner. There's no way that it could back out. There's no way that they could reverse this policy in any, realistically short time frame, because it would undermine prophetic authority. It would be viewed as a retreat. It would be viewed as showing that the church leaders just caved to public opinion, to pressure. And I think even the most progressive Mormons that I'm aware of, or hopeful or optimistic Mormons, would have predicted that this policy would have stayed on the books for 5 to 10 years at least. But here we are 3.5 years after the policy has been released. We hear today that it's been completely reversed. And when I say completely reversed, I mean completely reversed. Let me just read a little bit of what has been shared, and then we're going to get to interviewing our first guest. And by the way, we're going to be doing a marathon interview tonight where we interview several people who have opinions and thoughts and experiences about what has just happened. But before we introduce our hosts, I will just read a little bit of what's in the news. So the church released a statement from the First Presidency that apparently came from a General Conference leadership session. So General Conference is this weekend for the Mormon Church, and I guess they have all their leaderships in training right now in Salt Lake City. And the part that was particularly relevant is some details shared by President Dallin H. Oaks. And I'll just read it. It says, at the direction of the First Presidency, President Oaks shared that effective immediately, children of parents who identify themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender may be baptized without First Presidency approval if the custodial parents give permission for the baptism and understand both the doctrine that a baptized child will be taught and the covenants he or she will be expected to make. A non-member parent or parents, including LGBT parents, can request that their baby be blessed by a worthy Melchizedek priesthood holder. These parents need to understand that congregation members will contact them periodically, and that when the child who has been blessed reaches 8 years of age, a church member will contact them and propose that the child be baptized. Previously, our handbook characterized same-gender marriage by a member as apostasy. While we still consider such a marriage to be a serious transgression, it will not be treated as apostasy for purposes of church discipline. Instead, the immoral conduct in heterosexual or homosexual relationships will be treated in the same way. The very positive policies announced this morning, again, this is Elder Oaks, should help affected families. In addition, our members' efforts to show more understanding, compassion, and love should increase respect and understanding among all people of goodwill. We want to reduce the hate and contention so common today. We are optimistic that a majority of people, whatever their beliefs and orientations, long for better understanding and less contentious communications. That is surely our desire, and we seek the help of our members and others to attain it. These new policies are being sent to priesthood leaders worldwide, and will be included in online updates to our church handbook for leaders. And then sort of the tiny little gut punch at the end, at least for me and probably for others, the announcement at Mormon Newsroom, which needs to be changed. The name, of course, says, these changes do not represent a shift in church doctrine related to marriage or the commandments of God in regard to chastity and morality. The doctrine of the plan of salvation and the importance of chastity will not change. These policy changes come after an extended period of counseling with our brethren in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and after fervent, united prayer to understand the will of the Lord on these matters. So that is the announcement. It is taking the Mormon internet by storm. The New York Times has already written about it, as has the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune. And again, we are going to be covering it in detail tonight on Mormon Stories. And we have asked to join us for the initial discussion, Kyle Ashworth. And Kyle may not be familiar to many of you, but Kyle is, in my view, one of the most important voices right now in the Mormon LGBTQ conversation. So without any further ado, and by the way, we're going to have many other people on tonight. We're going to have Natasha Helfer Parker. We're going to have Greg Prince. We're going to have hopefully Dan Witherspoon, Mark Kriego, lots and lots of other cool people. We hope to have several LGBTQ people. We've invited many. So tonight we're going to do a marathon. We're going to have Zelf on the Shelf, Samantha and Tanner. We are going to have a lot of cool people. So expect sort of a longer night of discussion and conversation about what all this means. But I am super excited to begin our conversation with Kyle Ashworth, who I believe is, as I said, is one of the most important voices in the LGBT Mormon discussion today. So Kyle, for those who don't know anything about you, why don't I say, first of all, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast. And second, can you tell the listeners a little bit about you?
Hey, thanks, John. And thanks to the Mormon Stories family. Excited. This is kind of an odd and interesting day. It's one of those, well, Miss Lincoln, how was the rest of the play experiences as we kind of unpack this. But to give you a little bit of an introduction, I am the host of the Latter-Gay Stories podcast, which to many of the Mormon Stories listeners is formerly known, or also known as the Gay Mormon Stories podcast. And that was a podcast that was created 7 seasons ago in 2012 under the Open Stories Foundation. And we kind of revived that after a long karaoke conversation which John and I discussed bringing and reviving the Latter-Gay Stories podcast, the Gay Mormon Stories podcast. And so we kind of reinvented the podcast and brought it back to life, and have had great success in sharing the stories of the LGBT community and highlighting those difficult parts of the journey, and also the joyful parts of the LGBT experience, whether it's in or out of the LDS Church. A little bit of a background. In my world, gay man, originally followed the Mormon mantra, mission, marriage, children would all change the things that were core to my identity, I thought. So I did all the things that was necessary, all the things that was asked of me within Mormonism. Married for 10 years, eventually came out to my wife, who was incredibly loving, ultra supportive. Sometimes I often, as I talk about that coming out experience, if ever I felt unconditional love, it was in those moments when I had to be completely vulnerable. Coming out brought a host of interesting experiences. One was when we often talk about the coming out experience, it's just really crushing the walls and the facade that you build around yourself. And for me, it was that New Horizon experience. For the first time in decades, I was able to see a sunrise and sunset again, unobstructed by all the things that I'd created to hide who and what I was. So that experience was 2016. And here we are 3 years later, and life is pretty good. Living a life of authenticity and honesty, and a completely different trajectory than I ever had expected. Now divorced, super amicable divorce, a great relationship with my ex-wife, super relationship between the communities of just understanding and navigating the LGBT community. So, and that's kind of a brief part of my story. Definitely lots and lots more. But shortly after coming out, I, like many people in my same situation, especially fathers, returned missionaries, sought a tribe, tried to find my herd. And I joined many groups, many online groups and different organizations to try to find the people who would best relate to me. I went through North Star, eventually led my way through to Affirmation. It was in Affirmation that I joined a number of groups. And for about a year, I served as Affirmation's president of the Intermountain region, which was a 5-state area: Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, and which one am I missing? Arizona. So the 5-state region, essentially helping Affirmation create new chapters in that 5-state region. My work with Affirmation gave me the opportunity to not only help establish chapters of Affirmation throughout the 5-state region, but it also gave me the chance to visit with stake presidents and bishops and young men's and young women's leaders, the people who are in the grassroots of the Mormonism movement. Especially, I mean, you've got 2 groups of people within the grassroots section of Mormonism. You have those who really understand this idea of personal revelation and understand that when the general membership of the church comes out with a policy or a doctrine or a suggestion, that's nice, but sometimes there are other experiences or personal revelation that contradicts that. The other section of that group of Mormonism are those who have real life experiences, those who have children who are gay or trans. And those two groups of people were the focus of my work with Affirmation. I really sought out those because I thought the most amount of change that would happen within the church would happen with those who knew better. And once you know better and infuse yourself into this world, then you do better. So you had that group of people, those progressive stake presidents and bishops. And then there were the mothers and fathers of sons and daughters who had come out. And they were some of the greatest allies because they absolutely understood and knew this world. And they also knew that things had to change. So working with those 2 groups gave me a lot of experience in trying to better understand this, and also essentially helping us to create a coalition, a group of grassroots Latter-day Saints who wanted change and who were willing to advocate for change. Eventually, I kind of, as I mentioned a little earlier, knew that there was more to this story, and there was a greater way of helping people, and the Latter Gay Stories podcast was one of those ways. And that was really an opportunity to start featuring specific stories that could make an impact and benefit the overall message and our ability to help people see the LGBT people for the beautiful, spiritual, unapostate, non-counterfeit people that they are. And slowly but surely, I think have made a great impact. And you know, I think of the parents, I think of the stories, I think of all the other LGBT people who have helped support the Latter Gay Stories podcast. But then I also think, like today, the announcement of this, the rescinding of the policy was a text message that came to me from a 70. I'm guessing right within that meeting. So infiltrated within even Mormonism's deepest roots are advocates for the LGBT community. There are people inside the trenches within Mormonism who also advocated for change. And I think that's something that the LGBT community needs to know as well, that not every church leader is an Elder Oaks or a President Nelson or Boyd K. Packer, but there are allies within the leadership, the general authorities of the church, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm not saying that that I had any influence in the 70s decision to be an advocate, but I think our collective voices, and I think just genuine, down to earth, seeing people for who and what they are, helped cause this change.
All right, Kyle. Well, you gave us a fabulous intro, and if it's okay, I'd like to kind of go back a little bit and just ask you some questions point by point. We're also going to bring on other members of the community, but is it okay if we go back and cover a little bit of ground now?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so do you remember when the November 2015 policy came down?
Clearly, absolutely.
I know you said this in your intro, but where were you church-wise when that policy happened?
So I was a young men's president.
Where?
In Vernal, Utah.
Okay.
The Mazer, Utah Stake.
So you were in a mixed orientation marriage. How many kids?
I have 4 kids.
And you had been married for how long?
At that point in 2015, I had been married 7 or 8 years.
And I want to do an individual interview with you later, but so please forgive the brevity. The traditional, gay Mormon male story in the 2000s is that you would have known you were gay by a young age, probably 13. You would have probably hid it. You would have probably felt a lot of shame about it. You probably wouldn't have experimented in any way sexually before your mission. You would have served a mission and probably have been extra righteous. You may have come out after your mission, but may not have, and you might have engaged in various forms of attempts to change your sexual orientation, whether that be private or through a therapist or through a bishop. How much of that was or was not your experience?
Pretty verbatim.
Okay.
Surprise. Yeah. So yeah, I knew very early on. I knew I was different. Probably 7 or 8 years old. I grew up in what I've often called a gay ghost town. Didn't know anybody who was gay. We literally had a green screen Zenith television. In my family, we didn't get the internet until I was 17. So I literally lived a quite sheltered life. So I really didn't understand what the term or the meaning gay was until well after puberty, 12 or 13 years old, starting to put things together and starting to understand what that was. And exactly as you talked about, I was active in the church as well. So I was beginning to understand what the boundaries looked like and what was appropriate and not appropriate. And I knew whatever was happening within my brain and within myself was not acceptable in terms of how my family would treat it, but more importantly, how the church would treat it. Because to that, the church is everything. The church is your lifeline. It's your friendship. It's your community. It's your it is everything in your life, especially in a small town of 300 people or less. Everything that you did was surrounded by the church. So 12 or 13, I started putting all the pieces together and remained closeted. Honestly, didn't tell a soul until I came out to my now ex-wife. So never defied or was unfaithful to my wife. I kept our vows of marriage and really just tried to make things work. And you kind of brought that up a little bit. I think this is a consistent story among many people who you serve a mission, you serve righteously, you take on lots of callings, you keep yourself busy in the church in an attempt to put this all away. And that's kind of the Mormon message though, as well, as if things are going difficult in your life, it's because you're sinning or something's not working right. So you have to become more righteous. You have to devote more time to your callings. That's just kind of the message, and that's what's set up. So I went through that as well. But another element of my story is also, for some reason in the back of my mind, I always believed that maybe having children would solve this issue or make me more straight. So I do remember after the birth of my son, my first child, having this feeling of relief, that the same feeling that I had stepping off the airplane, coming home from my mission. I served an honorable mission. I did everything necessary. hopefully when I step off the airplane, these feelings will finally pass, because the mission will do it for me. And I remember I specifically walking off the airplane in Salt Lake International Airport and thinking to myself, dang it, I'm still gay. Maybe it would happen when I picked up my luggage or hugged my family or went home or was released. And so you always prolong these situations. For me, I kept prolonging or thinking this would all go away after each child. Had our first kid, our first son, it was still there. And I thought, well, maybe I haven't given myself the opportunity to prove myself to be a good father. So we had a second child and then a set of twins. So after 4 children, if it didn't work, the definition of insanity at that point, I was done being insane. And really it was then a struggle to try to understand how other people were making it work. And while married and still closeted, I was searching out for people who were like me. I was trying to find my herd, trying to find a group of people. And that led through online groups like North Star and eventually Affirmation. So sorry, that was a long way around that story, but very typical of, and I know there are listeners of this podcast as well who are closeted or in that same situation. And this is a well-traveled road. It's boulder free. It's paved. It is very, very familiar to many of us.
Yeah. And thank you for being willing to share and to allow us to do inadequate justice to the intensity and the complexity of your story. But for the sake of time, thanks for letting us kind of cover it so briefly. Hopefully we'll have you back to do the full story. Okay. So you were young men's leader in November 2015?
Yep, I'm pretty sure I was in the young men's presidency. Let's see here, the young men's. I'm sure I was the young men's. I know I was in the young men's. I served in the young men's program for 8 years, either as a quorum advisor, counselor, or the president. So I can't remember exact, but I know I was in the young men's program, which added this other weird element of my story, because you're in the young men's presidency and you're gay, and how would people find a figure, or how would they deal with that news if they actually knew? And it was an added level of stress. And then to have the policy come down, it was difficult.
Tell me more about difficult.
Well, as you can imagine, so a lot of the policy, if you turn back your clocks to that November 2015 day, there was a lot of confusion. And Elder Christofferson had to come out and clarify a few times based on the oddness of the way it was released. And as you mentioned in the intro, this wasn't a press release. It wasn't what we received today in a nice, well-worded presser from the Mormon newsroom. It was leaked, and as quiet as the church wanted to present this, it was the polar opposite. So it was difficult for the church to really nail down exactly what the message was. But my initial reaction was unbelievable. One, that my faith and my religion would stoop to this level to label a group of people who, for all intents and purposes, were active. And so initially I didn't understand all the nuances within the policy. But what my immediate reaction was this was a blanket statement over anyone who was LGB, because not much of the trans topic is covered in the November 2015 policy. But for the LGB members of the church, I couldn't understand it, that I knew and was aware of gay or queer members of the church who were actively participating in their church callings and honorable members of the church and upstanding citizens in the community, but yet they were labeled in the same group of people as apostates, murderers, polygamists, which were the other marginalized groups within Mormonism. So I struggled with that. That was my initial reaction. The second part of that was immediately I started thinking about the first article of faith and how we are not to be punished for Adam's transgressions or the sins of others. And then I thought about my children. I had 4 children at that point. And knowing that I was closeted and had no intention of ever coming out, I didn't fear that they would not be baptized, but my heart was crushed by the idea that other people in situations not similar to mine would possibly be told that they couldn't join the church. Future children wouldn't be able to be blessed. They wouldn't serve missions. They wouldn't be given the opportunity to integrate into the faith community. And by faith community, I mean, if you're familiar with Utah Mormonism, there's this very real experience where if you're not a member of the church, you're not acclimated or brought into the local community, and the children that are not members of the church are often ostracized. And I thought this was just another opportunity to ostracize children through no fault of their own because of a religion. So it was crushing. I then also considered the young men in my young men's organization. Some of them I knew had experienced some of these attractions as well, and they too were victims of this policy. They would grow up in a church that was a house divided. So all those are the three initial reactions I had when I first heard about the November 2015 policy. The other part of that was my inability to openly talk about it. My family, my in-laws, and my immediate family are, I mean, we can often call them TBMs, but very ingrained in the gospel. And so there wasn't much deviation. As a closeted gay man, the last thing you want to do is shine attention on yourself. So it was a really difficult space to live in, wanting to talk about it, but not knowing where and how to.
What's your sense for how the November 2015 LGBT policy affected LGBT Mormons and post-Mormons? Can you just give us a summary of its impact? If I said carnage, would that be too dramatic?
Well, so this, as you can imagine, this afternoon has been a very interesting experience for me within the post-Mormon and LGBT community. Everyone is clamoring for some sense or ability to understand this. The very real and very direct answer to your question: there is carnage. There are bodies that are attached to this November 2015 policy. People committed suicide over the inability to move forward based on the revelation that's not anymore of President Nelson. And that's difficult. I don't even know where to begin with the community. I still, I mean, we were discussing this in a Facebook group, one of our affirmation Facebook groups. And as you can imagine, through affirmation, this has been a topic of discussion all day long. The general consensus is this rescinding the policy doesn't change the initial creation of the pain. And there were people who were ostracized from their families. There were divorces that took place because of the 2015 policy. There were suicides that were completed because of the policy. If you want to talk carnage, it's real and it exists. And I don't know that just the rescinding of the policy today will change that. In fact, I'm confident the course of history and the plight of families and the very real pain that has caused the division among many Mormon families can be directly pointed or a direct contribution by the November 2015 policy.
Yeah, and it's a sober subject, and it's one that deserves kind of a sober approach.
There was nothing kind about the 2015 policy. The policy of exclusion was blatantly created to divide. And so I'm happy that you're bringing Greg on, Greg Prince. I'm interviewing Greg in a couple weeks because I think he's got a fascinating take on the inner workings of Mormonism. I was just at his book signing event at the University of Utah Library a couple weeks ago or last week, and one of the members in the audience, one of the participants in the audience, asked him a question, specifically asking what the LGBT threat to Mormonism was. And he discussed that a little bit, and then there was a little audience interaction back and forth. And generally, what was spoken of was that the threat to Mormonism through a queer member of the church was the inability to procreate, and was essentially it was defying this natural plan of salvation. And I thought, and in the back of my mind, I always wondered if it was deeper than that. If the November 2015 policy and the rollout and the blowback and the messaging and the results of the policy, when you look at that, it was not good for the church. As you mentioned in the introduction, thousands and thousands and thousands of people have left the church. It has ignited a group of advocates that were silent, myself included. It was an opportunity for people to truly understand either A, how revelation worked, or B, where they stood within Mormonism. And it wasn't good. So I wondered if, and I was in the same boat you were. I didn't think the November policy would be rescinded this quickly. And by 3.5 years, it was 4 years too late. But I wondered if the church, Oaks included, was among this group of people who refused to acknowledge that he or they were wrong. And because of that, they perpetuated this belief, and they just continued to push this narrative down the hill, thinking that it would gain momentum at some point. And when its own members the church was hemorrhaging members and continues to hemorrhage members, when its own members were abandoning ship, I think the church had a very confusing and difficult experience at that point. They had to decide whether or not they stopped doing what they were doing and stopped pushing this rhetoric, or become comfortable with the lighter weight in the wagon, knowing that they were hauling it all the way to Zion. And maybe by getting rid of the riffraff, the wheat and the tare, getting rid of the people who weren't making a generous contribution to the church, maybe the wagon would be easier to pull. And I thought that maybe because of the arrogance of some leaders, that was the message, that they, in a very real sense, were able to decide who they wanted in the church. And by getting rid of the LGBT members and those voices, it was easier to push a message. It was easier to keep people in a box. And when you're in a box, you're controllable. When you're not, you have what we have today, and a group of grassroots activists who were able, and I'm not saying this is all just a group of activism, but I think the very genuine, heartfelt messages of parents, the prayers of pleading children of LGBT members, all contributed to the rescinding of this policy.
So what was it? What was it like this morning? Did you say in your intro you talked about a church leader texting you? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I got a text about a half an hour before I saw it show up on the Mormon newsroom.
Around 8:30 in the morning?
It was right around 9 o'clock, somewhere around there.
Someone texts you, and what can you tell us about who that was and what they said?
I'm not going to reveal all my sources, John.
No, I don't want you to, but whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yes. So it was just really simple. It was come completely out of the blue, but the church will be officially announcing the end of the November 2015 policy today. This is a step in the right direction. I'll follow up soon. My immediate reaction was, are you serious? What? When? I wanted details. But you should see the presser in the next 30 minutes or so, and it'll make big waves in your community. And I just said, whatever you can share is important to me, and I thank you for thinking of me. And it was that simple. And so then I just looked around wondering what was happening. Just essentially waiting for someone or something to come out.
What thoughts or feelings ran through your head?
The first initial thought was, this is the church reeling from a massive exodus, And this is difficult for a mainstream Mormon to understand because as I've spoken with bishops and stake presidents throughout the 5-state region, there is a general consensus that there is nothing wrong. Mormonism has this funny thing. You have the standard of truth. The standard of truth has been erected. No unhallowed hand will stop the work from progressing. It doesn't matter what happens. The church will go forth boldly, nobly, and independently till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every ear. That's this great standard of truth, this great prophecy of Joseph. So it doesn't really matter what the church does. The church will fill the whole earth. And it's quite amazing how prophetic that is. So the church has set up this standard by which growth will be judged. Then the church has also created this idea that even the elect of Zion will fall away, that so many people from the church will leave, that only the few active, strong members will remain when Christ comes back, and that's how Zion will be recreated or reestablished. And so either way, if the church continues to hemorrhage members, it will grow. The prophecy that the elect will fall away based on policies like the LGBT issue, the November 2015 policy, all the other things that are thrown at members of the church. You can leave, that's okay. The church is still in good standing because we've been told that people like you will fall away. So I experienced that as I spoke with these bishops and branch presidents. But then I look at the hard numbers. I mean, you get to the point where the church stops releasing statistical data based on its growth.
So since the November 2015 policy, growth has declined to the point where the church is pretty much stagnant in the United States. It's hemorrhaging in Europe. It's hemorrhaging in developed Asia. It's growing in Africa, but the church has taken in with its millennial population. Some say as much as 50% or more of millennials raised in the church have left or will leave. Return missionaries are leaving at a massive rate, and defections have become, wards are being closed everywhere. Stakes are being closed. Wards and stakes are collapsing and being merged. Temple MTCs, missionary training centers, are being closed around the globe. Chapels are being sold off. And like you said, since the November 2015 policy, the Mormon Church has had to embarrassingly stop announcing statistics, which was its tradition in General Conference for how many decades? It's now no longer releasing statistics as a part of General Conference because the news is so stark, right?
Bingo. So as I sat with these bishops and branch presidents and stake presidents, I say, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either the standard of truth has been erected and the church will fill the whole earth, or it's not. And these church leaders were understanding that. And so when I saw the policy come across today, I thought, well, the church is elected to fill the wagon again. And I immediately thought that their initial reaction, I mean, if I were at 50 North Temple in the last 3.5 years and watched the membership fracture as it has, and you can challenge me if you're a totally believing Mormon, but I think the evidence is crystal clear. The writing is on the wall. The November 2015 policy this is greater than the 1978 edition, and this is greater than the 1891 edition.
What do you mean?
Well, 1891. Let's look at polygamy. The church was reeling from financial disaster. There was an impending issue of statehood. They struggled establishing Zion as they perceived it to be. So in 1891, the immediate ban on polygamy, and I say immediate ban, that's debatable as well, as the church took off to Cardston, Alberta, Canada to continue practicing, and various locations throughout the West and even down into Mexico. So there was this mild change in 1891 regarding polygamy. You move on to 1978, and when you look at blacks in the priesthood, that was a very house-divided experience for the church. My initial reaction listening this morning, I thought immediately about the members of the church who weren't going to react like Bruce R. McConkie reacted. You remember, I wasn't around in 1978, I was still 4 years in the spirit world. But Bruce R. McConkie, you recall what his reaction to the 1978 change in Revelation. He immediately said, forget everything we've said about blacks in the priesthood, essentially saying, scrap the rhetoric, scrap all the bigotry, the racism, the difficult things we said, and let's move on from where we're at today and move forward. I was in an interview today interviewing a guest for the Latter-day Stories podcast, and I asked that question as well. How well did the members of the church take that in 1978? I'm genuinely interested in, was it just a complete reversal? Did the members of the church say, like a light switch, oh, okay, I'm no longer racist. I no longer believe all the awful things Brigham Young spoke about people of color within the church. And then I correlated that to today's policy, the rescinding of this policy. And I wonder how eager members of the church are today to flip a light switch and just turn this all off and say, okay, we no longer believe that you're apostate. We no longer believe that your love is counterfeit. We no longer believe that your children are supposed to be punished for the sins of Adam. It's a new dawn, a new day, off we go. And so I liken this one. I just don't think Mormonism is in that same space. And I think this is more difficult. The church is now in a position where there's a lot of egg, and this is a messy situation. I don't know how they clean it up. I think the damage is extensive. I don't know statistically how many people took their lives in 1978 and prior due to their membership and the color of their skin. I also am quite confident that there weren't many suicides that happened in 1891 as a result of the overturning of the manifesto, or the manifesto overturning polygamy. But today, we have people who have lost their lives because of the 2015 policy. This one's different, and I don't know that we have a 1978 movement where people just automatically switch a light, turn off this light switch, and decide, oh yeah, we're okay with it. We are completely fine with this new revelation.
So there are always talks that there's not unanimity in the quorum. That let's just say Elder Holland was, I've heard reports that he was furious. Well, first of all, the reports were that Elder Nelson and/or Oakes rammed this through while Thomas S. Monson had dementia, and that they rammed it through without the full knowledge and consent of other members of the quorum, possibly, Dieter Uchtdorf, possibly Jeffrey R. Holland, possibly Tom Christofferson. It's hard to know exactly who was and wasn't in the know or in the room, or if all this is just speculation and rumor. But there's certainly been consistent rumor or gossip, and even sort of corroborated, insider information that there's not unanimity in the quorum around this issue. Do you have any information or opinions or speculation about that?
Yeah, I've heard some of the same things in our circles. I interviewed an ally family. They do not have an LGBT son or daughter. They just took it upon themselves to serve the LGBT community. Paul and Susie Augenstein. Paul was a bishop in Riverton, Utah ward, chose to hold a Fifth Sunday LGBT conference in his ward. It gained a lot of traction. And shortly after that experience, Susie wrote to Elder Holland and included within this manila envelope pages and pages. I'm thinking I think she said 20 or 50 pages, printed both sides of testimonials and experiences that these LGBT families were struggling with as they tried to reconcile their sexuality and their religion. It wasn't very long after that Elder Holland reached back out to Bishop Augenstein and his wife and said, I am on my way to do this world tour with President Nelson. I'm happy to meet with you. I want to meet with you. I want to discuss this. If you want immediate assistance, I want to get you in touch with a 70. And so there was a favorable 70. I don't recall who it was, who sat with them in the church office building and listened to them and understood them and was on board with what they were saying. And the Augustine's message was quite simple. It's just, we have to get to know the LGBT community better. We can't label them as within these boxes or just painted them in colors of black and white only, but their stories were more fantastic and more beautiful than they were given credit for. So I think Elder Holland is a bit of an ally. You'll recall the speech that Elder Ballard gave at BYU, where he said that clearly members of the church have not handled this topic very well, that we need to do better than we've done in the past. So I see Elder Ballard as being an ally. You get an Elder Uchtdorf who made attempts to apologize on behalf of the church, and that didn't go over very well for him. So I do believe
you're speculating that maybe his progressive approach possibly led to him being released from the first presidency. Is that what I hear you saying?
I mean, that's it is speculation, but it is very interesting. This when you lay this all out, let the cards fall as they fall, and that was a very interesting turn of events. I think the fact that Elder Oaks made the announcement, President Oaks made the announcement today, is telling. I think that's. I've contemplated that today, whether or not there's a correlation between his double down rhetoric and then his Bruce R. McConkie moment, where he essentially says, disregard all the things we said before. This is the new way forward. That would be a very humbling experience for President Oaks, who refuses to apologize. But yet, this was an about face. This was a 180-degree turn.
Right.
One more thing.
So you're thinking,
just why I'm thinking of this, John, let me just point out one other item. I attended the B1 event, the commemoration of the 40 years of the lifting of the ban on priesthood. I don't know if you attended that event at the conference center.
No, I didn't attend.
It was an interesting experience because President Oaks got up to speak, and he said a few things that were just astonishing to me. And among them were the fact that he from that pulpit on that night said, I never had a spiritual confirmation or a testimony that the black members of the church should have been withheld from the priesthood. He said he never had that confirmation. And then he brought in President Oaks and President Eyring, also never having that spiritual confirmation. And I thought to myself, what an interesting experience. Here you are as leaders of the church, influential leaders of the church, especially during this 1978 period. You sit in your pew and sing, do what is right, let the consequence follow, knowing that you have no spiritual confirmation or testimony that members of your own faith are allowed to have the priesthood based on the color of their skin, yet that you do nothing to change it. Ironically, that same group of people who are now the leaders of the church in 2018, at that point, during that conference, were the same three who were pushing this narrative, and Oaks double, triple, and quadrupling down against the LGBT community. We're continuing this narrative. And so I always thought, I wonder if at some point Oaks comes up and says, I never had a testimony or a spiritual confirmation that the policy of exclusion should have been. It's just confusing to me that in that circumstance, he was willing to throw himself, President Eyring, and President Nelson under the bus. And now here we are, months later, with the rescinding of the November 2015 policy. I wonder who will become the sacrificial lamb. I wonder.
Well, let's talk about that. So in the explanation, it seemed like to some small degree, they kind of mentioned that this came from President Monson. So immediately, what the bell that went off in my mind is, okay, they're pinning this on Monson, and that's why I just mentioned his state of dementia at the time.
He was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. He was not in his, and that is not a disputed fact. He was in and out of consciousness. He was in and out. He was delusional in the last parts of his life. So I think that's difficult for. It's convenient for the church, but that's not. I don't think that's a very above board explanation as to why this should have come out now as opposed to later.
And the statement that I read at the beginning of the show mentions President Monson specifically. So I don't know if it's fair to say that they're kind of pinning on him, but also like I said, it's generally understood that Nelson and or Oaks kind of pushed this behind the scenes. So are you there's two different ways to do it, that they're gaslighting us. That's kind of one way to think about it. Another is that by reversing this so explicitly, publicly, they didn't try and slip it, into a policy. They got ahead of it, made the press release, reversed it within 3.5 years. And Oaks himself was the one, delivering the message. You could interpret that as him eating crow and them admitting that they were wrong, just not in a very overt way. What are your thoughts about that?
You're not going to get this in black and white. I think Oaks's previous statements on apologizing for mistakes in the church are quite clear that that's not going to happen, at least under his tenure. A number of things come to mind, though. I was listening to Derek Kitchen, state senator from Utah, as he discussed a little bit about this earlier this afternoon. And as many of you recall, I think a lot of this November 2015 policy came out essentially as a legal brief, as a way to continue the rhetoric and the message, but also protect the church legally. And I agree with you. It was rammed through as quickly as possible under circumstances that were not quite favorable. The interesting thing about the presser that came out today was the very last sentence where I think I've got it pulled up here. These policy changes come after an extended period of counseling with our brethren in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and after fervent united prayer to understand the will of the Lord on these matters. I wonder where that message was in 2015. Where was the fervent united prayer? Where was the will of the Lord on these matters? Because either God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, or he changed his mind. And because that's how it was sold 3.5 years ago, that this was the will of the, and you referenced Nelson's speech in Hawaii. An interesting part about that, it was his speech that this was revelation was added into the correlated materials only to be taken back out again because there was not consensus that this was revelation. So I do believe that the church got, again, I go back to this, I think they got themselves in a conundrum. They did not anticipate the hemorrhaging of members and the increasing possibility that they would continue to lose members as long as this was on the books.
So what were your feelings around wanting, expecting, hoping for an apology, and what would that have meant to you?
You can't apologize for people who are, this is difficult. I interviewed a person today who works with suicide prevention, and she was in the car traveling past the cemetery to visit the grave of a woman who committed suicide. And there are many others who are dead because of policies like this, specifically this policy. How do you apologize for that? There is no adequate apology. There's nothing that Mormonism can do that reverses the pain, the separation, the irreversible effects of death based upon rhetoric and policy that they initiated. I don't know that myself or many in the LGBT community, I shouldn't say that we're not looking for an apology. An apology is necessary, but I don't know that the apology fixes anything. You know, part of the repentance process is very interesting, that the church has a different process in terms of repentance than its own members, than the process is required of its own members. You look back into Mormonism's theology, and it teaches us that we have to turn from the sin. So we abandon it, we apologize, we make restitution, and then we commit that sin no more and continue on. That applies to members of the church, but that same standard does not apply to the church. How do you make restitution to the family that weeps over a granite tombstone that is engraved with the name of their son or daughter? There's no adequate way of doing that. How do you solve or reconstruct a marriage that ended in divorce because of the 2015 policy? There's no way to do that. How do you tell friends like you and I have, John, and friends of many listeners of this podcast who were excommunicated because of their marriage that was legal and lawful and chaste
and loving,
who were active members of the church, who fulfilled their callings, who had bishops who were willing to give them additional callings as same-sex married couples. And then they were excommunicated for apostasy. How do you apologize for that? I think it's impossible to apologize. That's why I think this is such a conundrum. And as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, the church has quite literally painted themselves into a very difficult spot. And I think at this point, they just have to move forward, and they collect the collateral damage. They onboard whoever is willing to jump back into the wagon. And I believe that there will be some who are willing to leap back into the wagon. But I think many of us have abandoned ship and realized what the church is. And I think that's difficult space for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, I get what you're saying. How do you apologize for this? On the other hand, I mean, if you've really done something wrong, apologies are always hard. And some would hold the church to the highest of standards because of the extraordinary claims they make to be the one true church, to be special witnesses of Christ. And so some would say, Kyle, are you letting the brethren in the church off too lightly to not demand an apology? And I'm not saying we should. I'm not interested in rhetoric that's divisive right now per se. But what would you say to that they of all people, regardless of how much damage has been caused, they of all people should be apologizing profusely? I mean, the one possibility is they're not sorry, that they really believe. I mean, part of the press release was God did it then and God's doing it now. And it's possible they just believe it. In some sense, they're not just throwing Thomas Monson under the bus. They're kind of, I don't want to say throwing God under the bus, but they're pinning this on God. They're basically saying God did it then and God did it now. And who are we to judge God's holy ways? What are your thoughts on all that and the apology?
Well, let me use an analogy that was often used by Boyd K. Packer, and I rarely quote Boyd K. Packer. But remember his story about the young boy who was on top of the mountain and found the snake, and right. The snake, the boy said, "You're a rattlesnake. I don't want to pick you up." And immediately the snake had convinced this young boy to put him in his pocket and bring him down the mountain. And as the boy did that, the snake, who was lethargic at the time and cold, warmed up inside the boy's pocket. And as he got to the bottom of the hill, the snake bit him. And the boy was confused and said, "Why did you bite me? You were so nice to me on top of the hill," especially when the snake was cold and lethargic. And the snake simply said, "You knew I was a rattlesnake before you picked me up.
You knew who I was when you picked me up.
You knew that." And so I think today is evidence of the rattlesnake that was picked up and bit. It's traveler, it's carrier. And is there an apology? John, yes, I believe that the church should apologize. I think that's necessary for the church to apologize. But does it take away the sting? Does it mitigate the damage? No, it doesn't. I think the damage is irreversible. I think it is generations to come will still feel the impact of the November 2015 policy. And I don't know how the church recoups. I don't. Do they play nice? Do they become lethargic again? Do they sweet talk? I'm sure that will happen. I'm sure there will likely be conference talks coming up this weekend that will fawn to the vulnerable within the ranks of Mormonism, that will try to brush this aside as another opportunity for us to grow and become better people. But which I think is in many senses good, because I think the nature of humanity is that we should be good and that we should do well to the people around us. But that does not give us compensation or restitution for what's happened. And the Mormonism's easy answer is, well, you'll just have to forgive. And maybe that's just what has to happen. Maybe there is just an element of forgiveness, and then we move on. We don't move in, we move on.
So there's no way to take away the sting, and you're right. There's no way, I guess, that this can be made right, even with a profuse apology. But, I had to kind of check my feelings, because on the one hand, progressive and post-Mormons can't scream about how much they hate the church's actions or policies. And then when the church actually improves their policies and makes positive changes, then we hate the church and torpedo it for being hypocrites, or for, acting in a way that questions its inspiration from God, right? So part of me feels like, number one, part of us has to celebrate these changes, just because I think on face value, it's going to lead to less suicides. But then, and even if we look at this cynically and say, oh, it's all about the money, or it's all about the hemorrhaging, I think if we're acting in our wise minds and charitably, I think there's got to be some sincerity to these changes as well, that the brethren knew that they were hurting people, they knew that they were damaging people, or they knew that they had made a mistake. I mean, or that they want it, or they sincerely believe that God wants this change to happen. Whatever it is, I think there's going to be many positive things that come from these changes. Can you speak to that point?
I agree with you. Within the ally community, that discussion is already happening. You have to understand the ally community is to understand this. You have a marginalized community, which is the LGBT community. This is a rare experience, an opportunity for the LGBT community. I often use the analogy, and I've discussed this in a few places that I've spoken. This analogy that often trying to understand and trying to get the church to move in a positive direction in terms of the LGBT experience is like the dog who constantly is chasing cars, fruitlessly, but every day gets up in the morning, chases a car, and has no way of actually engaging with and capturing this vehicle. Today, the dog caught the car, and now what do you do with it? That's where we're at. And I know that there's this.
What do you mean by that? The dog caught the car?
Well, it seemed like an impossible task. You have this dog that's chasing the car all day long, and often you drive by and laugh because you think you're never going to catch me. And now that the dog has been able to lynch itself onto the bumper, and the church has backed off on something that it was, I hate to say, using to pester or become create this level of animosity between a community, but in a very real sense, the two collided today, and not in this deathly fashion, but today time somewhat stopped for both communities. And now how do we move forward? What do we do with the bumper? What do we do with this car now that we've caught it? And I've heard this argument used along many mainstream Latter-day Saints. Well, what do you want to do in the church? What are you trying to change? What is your real message? You're never going to get gay marriage in the temple. There are a lot of people that are not advocating for that. There are a lot of people who are not trying to push for complete inclusion. There were people that were just trying to push for the November policy to be disbanded. But where do we go from here today? I know that there are ally families who are rallying the troops, who are willing to take the LGBT people back and allow them to sit in their pews next to them. I think the statement is very interesting as well, the church put out. I think it's still quite vague, but not labeling a group of people as apostates. What does that say about the church's view on gay marriage now? Because they now are acknowledging that heterosexual and homosexual marriages are marriages, and that they are acceptable and not apostate. The homosexual marriage is no longer apostate in their words. So I think there's an opportunity of moving forward. Do I think the LGBT community rushes back into the pews of Mormonism? I don't think so. I don't know that that's going to happen. Do I think the LGBT community anxiously awaits more inclusion and less criticism or ridicule or marginalization or ostracism from the LDS community? I think that's more likely. I think the LGBT community is looking to the LDS community to build bridges. And it may not be, hey, you fully believe and accept what I'm doing in my life, but believe that I exist and believe that my experience is my experience. Believe in my own personal revelation and that of the other allies out there and the other supportive parents, the supportive bishops, the supportive stake presidents who firmly believe that there is nothing inherently or intrinsically wrong with the LGBT community, that they're not broken, that they shouldn't be felt or left to be alone, and that there's nothing about them that is apostate or counterfeit or necessary to be marginalized. I think that's the message that comes out of the rescinding of this policy, is that there is a more equal and level playing field, and less of this back and forth, us versus them. At least I hope. That's my hope.
I have to wonder, like, we're going to be bringing on someone later in this program tonight who was just excommunicated for marrying his, partner just a few weeks ago.
Good friends of mine.
What's that?
Good friends of mine.
Yeah. And number one, I have to wonder, is the church, and by the way, their letters stated they were excommunicated for apostasy. So those were the charges, and they were excommunicated. And now it's no longer apostasy. Well, is there a retroactive kind of, assessment? Is there retroactive action to sort of forgive these, gentlemen and the others who have been excommunicated?
Yeah,
and then
it's a very good point, because what do you do? Do you now excommunicate these people? Is that I'm flying out to California this weekend, and there was another couple that is pending a disciplinary council next week because of their same-sex marriage. Now I wonder if our interview is back on again because he wanted to hold off because his stake president was pressuring him so much about into getting having this disciplinary council. I wonder about that. I mean, obviously that policy's now been rescinded, so he likely will not have a disciplinary council. But do you now excommunicate? Is that even possible to excommunicate somebody? A very, very weird territory.
Yeah. And then there's another question. Basically, will this mean that bishops and stake presidents are less likely to excommunicate same-sex married individuals going forward, right?
I believe this gives them the excuse that they needed to act upon their own personal revelation and not on what a handbook told them to do. Because And I don't know, I think this might have been shared with your community, with the Mormon Stories community, about there was kind of an undercurrent with other 70s, but I recall, I remember it was either I read something or came across it in a discussion with a stake president, that there was a 70 who was offering resignation in lieu of excommunication, advising the stake presidents, I understand you don't want to excommunicate them because you don't believe in the policy. Offer to your member a resignation in lieu of excommunication, and just blatantly put it out on the table saying, if you'll just resign, then we won't have to go forward with the resignation. And I saw this with your, this isn't anything to do with the November 2015 policy, but with your listeners and guests on the podcast from Ohio, who are now being faced with their excommunication for creating a post-Mormon group. And that letter specifically said, if you want to just resign today, then we'll cancel the disciplinary council. And I think that was another end around to giving the stake president some leeway to not enforce something that they didn't believe in.
Yeah, and that's just standard policy. It's so less messy for the church to just offer resignation. It avoids them having to convene a council. It avoids any stake presidency or high council or bishopric members having to get infected by the cognitive dissonance of doing such a barbaric act. It avoids media attention. It allows the church to just say, oh, they resigned, even if the church kind of forces them to resign or pressures them to resign. So I have all sorts of problems with the fact that they offer that.
Oh yeah, hands down, I do as well. But I do want to I especially want to be on the record to say I appreciate progress, and as awful and dirty and nasty as this whole thing is, today we saw a little progress, and we're a long ways from the 1897 General Conference talk of George Buchanan, who said the easiest way to deal with the gay, and the word gay or homosexual wasn't used at that point, but in reference to gay or queer members of the community in Zion in Salt Lake at that time, was by being faithful enough that God would remove them from earth, that he would kill them himself. He bore apostolic witness of that from the General Conference pulpit. We had times where the BYU president, Wilkinson, openly at a BYU devotional said, if there are any homosexuals who are at this university, if you will be brave enough to disclose yourself, we will refund your tuition and we will allow you to leave this school. We do not want you to contaminate the other students at BYU. We had Mark E. Peterson, Boyd K. Packer, Spencer W. Kimball, awful, terrible rhetoric. Slowly we've gotten better. We're not where it needs to be today yet, but I do think that we have made progress. And I'm one who will recognize progress and give credit where credit is due. I'm not one of these people who are willing to completely burn the house down with never any intent to rebuild it. I am okay with trying to salvage what is salvageable. And I do think that today is a salvageable experience. And there is some progress there.
Beautiful. Well, Kyle, it's 6:30. That's the time we decided that you needed to run to another event. Listeners, do not go away. We have at least another 2.5, 3 hours of really important content lined up, including just immediately as soon as Kyle drops off. But before you drop off, Kyle, just tell us again how people can follow your work, your podcast, etc., because we love you and we love your voice.
We are easy to find. We on our social media sites, we are on all the social media sites. The easiest is to jump over to Facebook, facebook.com/LatterGayStories. We didn't want Satan to win too many battles, so we dropped the Gay Mormon Stories name and jumped into, no, that's just a joke, but Latter Gay Stories.
You can't use the word Mormon anymore, right?
I know. I didn't want Elder Oaks to get upset, so I specifically made sure that the Latter Gay Stories was the name of the podcast, and that Satan had no more additional victories. You're able to. I would love it. I would appreciate it if you followed the podcast at Latter Gay Stories. We have a YouTube channel. Instagram and Facebook. We're easy to find. We also have a complete interactive website at latterdaystories.org. And I do want to give a quick plug too, because through the Latter Day Stories website, we have been able to reach bishops, branch presidents, stake presidents, and that's through our resource tab. I created a church leader guide and a home and family guide. When the church made this turn to begin doing these home-centered church programs, ditching the third hour of church and asking its members to focus on topics that were relevant to the family, I thought it was wise to create a home and family guide that would help introduce an LGBT discussion in a family setting, because I knew, and this might have crossed the desk of an apostle as they were recreating this idea of a restructuring of the church. But I knew that if we got around a kitchen table and talked about issues that were prevalent to our family and discussed ever in a Sunday school or young men's group like the LGBT topic, that it was more likely to happen at home. And so if you go to the latterdaystories.org website and click on the resource tab and then scroll down, there are a number of resources available if you want to have an LGBT discussion within your own family. A lot of them are resources that link directly to the church, and it is for members of the church who are specifically active or more exclusively mainstream Mormons. But there's some good content there to have this discussion, to open up the dialogue with your children and with your family members to help discuss that. So again, kind of a shameless plug, but latterdaystories.org, or visit our Facebook page. We're constantly, each week, we have a new episode. We feature stories, written stories, coming out stories, twice a week. So there's constant and good information that's coming through on the podcast. And I appreciate each of our listeners and know that every one of us has some form of a story to share. I always look for the remarkably normal and the extraordinarily average, because I think that is where a story becomes most relatable.
Beautiful. Well, Kyle Ashworth, it's just so wonderful to have you. You are a phenomenal spokesperson, and we are just thrilled at the work you're doing, and we're thrilled that you would join us on Mormon Stories podcast to share your perspective on this historic day. So will you please join us again sometime soon?
I'm happy to. Thanks, John. Thanks to your community. Thanks to all of the Mormon Stories family. I am indeed grateful for the work that all of us are doing to help shine light on a topic that has been shadowed and darkened for way too long. And I appreciate everyone and all that they're doing to push this through.
All right, Kyle. Join us again soon, and take care and keep up the great work.
Thanks, John.